Good afternoon and welcome to Have We Got Planning News for You? We hope you had a good week so far. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us, and thank you future YouTube viewers for catching up on us later. Can I start with the usual reminders? Please do consider making a charity donation to the NHS Combined Charities Just Giving page or a charity of your choice. And please do, of course, keep the questions and banter flowing as usual in the Q&A box. Sasha this week is going to be the one of us who's going to put at least one of your questions to our esteemed guest. And that guest is a true legend of local government who we're really honoured to have on our show, none other than Sir Howard Bernstein. Howard, thank you very much indeed for joining us. We're really thrilled to have you here. Perhaps you can tell us where you're calling from this evening. And you're on mute, as is Mary.
I'm at home at the moment, but I see you're wearing the right shirt anyway.
Yeah, well, I changed it. I must confess, I did buy a King Eric shirt before, and then somebody drew my attention to your affiliation, so I thought I'd better change that. Hanging up before we started, so I think I could probably set it off against tax. One of my best mates is really horrified that I'm a Man United fan, really horrified. Now, Paul's going to be leading the discussion with you, Sir Howard, later on in the second half of the show, and judging from our prep session yesterday, by goodness, we have a fascinating chat ahead. I'm really, really looking forward to it indeed. You're in for a treat, dear viewers. In the meantime, let's introduce the regular panel. Can you say who you are, where you're calling from, what you're drinking, and your contribution to this week's theme, starting as ever with Mary back in the woods.
I'm back in the wild woods of Wandsworth. I've been to Reading in order to do a local plan examination, and I'm back in Wandsworth. Anyway, good evening, everybody. Hello, Mary Cook from Town Legal. Lovely to see our esteemed guest, and I'm slightly ashamed to tell you that I'm drinking ginger beer. My ginger beer does not, I'm afraid, come from Manchester. Please forgive me. But remember, for a southerner like me, I've moved away from my Cornish gin for 1 week only to a lovely product made in Northumberland. Cheers.
Cheers, Mary. Paul, how are you? I think you're slightly underplaying the amount of Manchester stuff you've got going on around you.
With some Wellingtons, a bottle of co-op brewed Stockport beer. I've got a Manchester behind me. I'm actually in my son's bedroom for various reasons, and who was born in Manchester as well. And my other son, I've raided his wardrobe, and I've got Manchester's premier sporting team here. Granted, it's a vintage sale shirt, but it's nonetheless a Manchester team. Nice to see you, Sir Howard.
Fantastic, fantastic. Chris, great to see you last night, mate.
Yes, we had a drink in the pub. Well, we still can. Yeah, a couple of brummies in a pub in London.
What can possibly go right?
Stuck out like sore thumbs. Yes, I'm in Chambers in London. I've just finished a 6-hour conference, which is why I'm still dressed in my suit. I don't have anything to drink other than water. But what I do have, and I notice you have something similar, is I have this, which my clerks went out to get from Sports Direct, which is exactly where you got yours from.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not so grand as to get someone else to get it for me. I had to walk to Sports Direct myself.
Yes. So when Sasha is talking, I'm going to go off screen and change into my football top.
Fantastic. Sash, good afternoon. You're wearing the right coloured tie.
I am. I'm wearing my special edition Hermes Man City tie. And this was made for Sir Howard's current owners of City. They get this on the Champs-Élysées most weeks. I am in London, and I wanted to also, I'm going to make a revelation that will frighten certainly Paul and Sir Howard. I'm going to reveal first time publicly that my great uncle was born in Manchester and was a Danzig, and you will both know Danzig Street. Yep. So I'm admitting that publicly, that I have a bit of Mancunian in me, which I'll probably never recover from being a true Gooner, but there we go. And I also wanted to celebrate. It's a pretty special week when Liverpool and United concede 13 goals. So we'll also enjoy that. I don't know why, and I suppose I've got an Orangina, probably a reflection of my knowledge of geography, probably comparative to Chris's of Scottish planning law, but we'll hear about that a bit later.
Yeah,
Sasha, just before we go any further, just remind me, who was it who beat Liverpool 7-2?
Absolutely fair. Absolutely fair. Great, with a great Arsenal goalkeeper.
Aston Villa. I got a text from Sue Mans telling me about the score, which almost makes up for her suggesting the favourite building that she would reduce to rubble is Villa Park.
well-known judicial Villa fan, Mr. Justice Dove, I was in front of today, and he hadn't wiped the smile off his face. Charlie Banner here. I'm in Chambers as usual, and I'm drinking Northern Monk. It's the nearest I get to man. It's actually brewed in Leeds, so it's not actually Manchester at all. So I'm probably committing some horrendous northern heresy by drinking it, but it's rather tasty actually. Good. Well, we'll kick off with the serious stuff first. And Mary, you're going to tell us about the first of our two High Court cases this week.
Yes, indeed I am. This case is all about nuclear power stations. Sizewell A, you will all recall, is being decommissioned. Sizewell B is an operational station and is providing 3% of our electricity energy supply. And Sizewell C is a new proposed nuclear power station, which is the subject of a DCO application that was made in May 2020. Now, the case that I want to talk about concerns a challenge to the grant of planning permission under the 1990 Town and Country Planning Act for replacement facilities for Sizewell B for planned and unplanned outages. So this was a planning application for effectively relocation works to take place in advance of the grant of any consent in relation to Sizewell B. But the raison d'etre, as it were, of this planning application was to reduce the time that would be taken to get Sizewell C up and running if and when a DCO consent were to be granted. The site lies in the AOMB, and the principal issue in relation to ground one of this challenge was all about paragraph 172 of the NPPF, because you will all recall that when you are dealing with major development in the AOMB, you have to demonstrate exceptional circumstances for major development. So they made the planning application in April 2019. The planning committee resolved to grant planning permission in accordance with the officer recommendation. Mr. Justice Holgate described a report as being a very careful and detailed document. He also described the minutes of the meeting as providing a very detailed and helpful record of the process. And the applicant in this case had quite a fight just getting consent to bring the claim. They had an oral hearing, and of their 3 grounds on the oral hearing, the judge gave them permission to proceed on 1 ground only. That was in June. Then they went to the Court of Appeal and got permission to pursue a 2nd ground, so that they weren't able to proceed on all 3 grounds. And that's quite important, because the ground that they were not able to proceed on meant that the planning authority had not erred in law in treating the designation in the National Policy Statement for Nuclear Power of Sizewell C as a potentially suitable site for nuclear power, for a nuclear power station, as itself representing an exceptional circumstance justifying major development in the AOMB. And perhaps I should also have mentioned the point that Sizewell B is also in the AOMB, so that the AOMB is already affected, some might say infected, But it's affected already, that the AONB there is already to some extent affected. The grounds on which the claimant was left with were firstly that the council acted unlawfully in failing to consider the need for the advance works in a precise enough manner. In one sense, there was no need for these facilities because they already existed at Sizewell B, and there was no planning permission for Sizewell C. But the specific need in this case was the reduction in delay in carrying out the Sizewell C project. But there was no particular assessment of how long that delay was. And that was really the nub of the complaint. And Mr. Justice Holgate dismissed that. The interesting part, I think, of this is the discussion in the judgment about the difference between exceptional circumstances in the AONB as compared to in the Greenbelt, where you will all know that in the Greenbelt, as a matter of policy, inappropriate development is deemed harmful. That is not the position with relation to the AONB. And also with regard to the AONB and the MPPF, you get specific advice on what factors to consider in taking into account exceptional circumstances. You get no such guidance in relation to exceptional circumstances in the Greenbelt. So a very detailed officer's report saw that challenge off. And then the other briefly very interesting second ground of the challenge was in relation to the EIA regs, and a point was being taken in relation to regulation 26 of the EIA regs. Had the council reached a lawful conclusion that the EIA information was up to date? The surveys, the ecological surveys, and this is a problem many of you will grapple with regularly, were more than 3 years old. But in the end, the council's ecologist was persuaded that because there had been such a long history of ecological surveys over a long period of time, some 10 years or so, the fact that those surveys were 3 years 3 years old at the date of the permission didn't make the decision to accept those surveys out of date, and therefore it didn't mean that the conclusion that they reached with relation to the EIA regs was unlawful. So that's all from me on that one.
Thanks, Mary. Sasha, you're up next, and in the week where we have seen the Holocaust Memorial Inquiry open, you're going to deal with the case that sort of was the precursor to that inquiry.
Yes, I'm obviously going to be sensitive about this because there is an inquiry taking place which commenced on Tuesday, and one has to be aware of that determination about whether the planning permission should be granted. This concerns a High Court challenge made before that public inquiry by the London Historic Parks and Gardens Trust, who had a concern about the case because in that matter, who has applied to build the Holocaust Memorial but the Secretary of State for Communities, Local Government and Housing. So there's a case where they make an application to Westminster that is called in, interestingly, by the Minister of Housing under Section 77, the call-in powers, and the London Historic Parks and Gardens Trust, who have a concern, have an objection, frankly, are concerned about effectively the decision maker in this matter. And the line of attack, this was Mr. Justice Holgate, and I do want to give a shout out to him because we've got in the context, and I do want to talk 1 week, we must let our guns be trained on the government's judicial review. Because when you see the thoroughness and judgment in this decision, it's pretty powerful about the quality and caliber of the High Court. And I'm not just saying that for Mr. Justice Holgate. I've got no cases in front of him, but I do advise everyone to have a look at it. But in essence, what this case, the line of attack was the transposition of European directives into regulations. I mean, you do think, I've always felt only in Britain would we have that system of transposition and the confusion it caused. And in that, Article 9 of the directive effectively requires that where the competent authority is also the developer, which is the case here, member states shall at least implement within their organisation an appropriate separation between conflicting functions, which of course is sensible. Then under Regulation 66, remember what I just said, what we put in the regulation is that must make appropriate administrative arrangements to ensure that there is a functional separation. So remember the difference between an appropriate separation in the directive and functional separation in the regs. Now, what the fundamental question for the court was twofold. Was that transposition accurate and acceptable? Did the EC directive effectively be successfully transposed or accurately transposed? And the second question was about the handling arrangements. And this case is quite interesting because the handling arrangements that had been set out in the ministry were appendices. So anyone interested in the way call-ins are dealt with should have a look at that. And rather interestingly, the judge decided that they had successfully, Regulation 64.2 did transpose so acceptably. But in terms of handling, Mr. Justice Holgate gave some pretty firm guidance and amendments to how this case should be handled, which obviously do affect the inquiry that is being held now. So I think that's a really interesting case, looking at how the Secretary of State effectively determines call-in decisions when he is actually the applicant for planning permission. So Charlie, that's my summary of that case. And I should just note, apparently there is permission being sought in the Court of Appeal, so it doesn't stop here.
Thanks, Ash. And of course, as probably most viewers are aware already, anyone wanting to catch some of the Holocaust Memorial Inquiry is a very, very well run YouTube link on Westminster City Council's page, worth catching a glimpse of, as indeed the Heathrow appeal has been streamed live this week as well, the Heathrow appeal in the Supreme Court. So two very big planning cases that you've been able to watch live. I'm going to deal with the first of the two planning appeals we're briefly covering. This is a written reps appeal decision relating to a 105 dwelling residential development in Consett in Durham County Council's administrative area. It was an unallocated greenfield development in countryside on the edge of the settlement, and the main issue was the effect of the development on the settlement character and appearance. Now, the local authority had a 5-year supply, and the inspector considered its policies were up to date, and so no tilted balance in play. And the recent pattern of appeal decisions would be with a situation where you're an unallocated development on outside the settlement boundary, and there is a 5-year supply, and the policy up to date. It's not looking good for you, particularly in a written reps appeal. But in this case, the appeal was allowed. Inspector Mary Louise Milliken allowed the appeal on the basis that the development would be well related to the existing pattern of development in Consett, and that whilst there would be some change to the character of the local landscape, that change would be appropriate, her word, and sympathetic to local character, again, her words. And as a result, she considered that the relevant development plan policies in relation to landscape and settlement character were satisfied, and very old policies too, from 97. Now, what I find interesting about this decision is the lack of any reference to harm. You do not find the word harm once in the decision. And many landscape professionals and decision makers, both at local authority level and in PINs, read the guidelines on landscape and visual assessment, impact assessment, GLIVIA, in such a way that any greenfield development will necessarily be harmful to landscape character on the basis that any new build on unbuilt land is necessarily harmful, and on the basis that any visibility of new built form will necessarily be harmful. And now we know that to meet the housing crisis, greenfield development is going to be needed up and down the country in appropriate locations. And therefore evaluating such development by an approach that simply asks, how bad is it, isn't, to my mind, very helpful. An approach that equates change with harm, when we know in policy terms that kind of change is in principle going to have to happen in some places, it doesn't help. So the focus of this decision on whether the change is appropriate and whether it's in keeping with the settlement pattern, rather than simply treating change as necessarily harmful, is, I suggest, to be welcome, and hats off to Inspector Milliken for that, particularly in a written reps appeal without the benefit of the more detailed scrutiny you get at a hearing and inquiry. So all the more commendation for dealing with it on the basis of that more limited process. I've been talking about the decision with Andy Cook, who many of you will know, and he's highlighted two other decisions decisions in a similar vein. One of Rasheen Barrett in January 2020 regarding appeal in Takeley, and one of Rachel Bust regarding Milton under Which 2018. I think one of those is yours, Chris. And they do remain, though, I think, the exception rather than the norm in decision taking. The default is to apply Glivia in such a way that any greenfield development would necessarily be harmful, and we're just debating how bad is it on the scale of bad to very bad. And as I say, I suggest this approach is helpful. It would be even more helpful if we got some guidance from this in the next version of Glivia, or indeed in PPG, so that we have a more consistent and constructive approach to evaluating these kinds of developments, rather than being at the lottery of which decision maker you've got and what's their particular subjective approach to this kinds of issue. And I would suggest also perhaps we could start by talking about landscape and visual effects rather than landscape and visual impacts, because to my mind, the word impact is a loaded word and effects is a much more neutral word. Anyway, that's my tuppence worth. And now we're going to do our first Scottish appeal. And who better do that than Chris McYoung? Chris has promised to do it in the Scottish accent. So over to you.
Well, that's right, Charlie boy.
Oh,
Jesus.
Now, Paul, I've been bet a significant amount of money for charity if I do the whole thing in a Scottish accent.
I've actually done it.
So,
When are you going to start?
well, yeah, all right, I won't do it. If you're gonna take the mick, I'm not doing it. All right, do I do it in a Scottish accent, Paul, or not? Your choice.
Yeah, you go for it, Chris.
All right, son. All right, thank you. 2 decisions from Scotland, Edinburgh. In fact, inspectors in Scotland are called reporters, and they are appointed by the Scottish ministers. The inspector's name was Christopher Warren. No, Christopher Wren. That's
Right. Time out. Whatever you're being bet, we'll all meet it. We'll match it.
All right.
I'm
Okay.
to blame for this.
The appellant was Springfield Properties, both issued on the 29th of September. The larger scheme was for 505 dwellings, and the smaller one for 199. Both appeals dismissed. The inspector's decision might be summarised in this way. In no way are you having permission for housing in that green belt. The main interest here is in the 5-year land supply. And at the time when the government in England are consulting through the planning white paper about removing the 5-year land supply test in England, it is worth looking at examples elsewhere. You'll know in Wales that technical advice note number 1 has been withdrawn, so there is no 5-year land supply in Wales. In Scotland, they still have it, and it's remarkably similar. And the wording requires decision makers to look at the adequacy of the effective housing land supply. That's all pretty familiar to us, but it wasn't straightforward by any means. In fact, we might describe the situation here in terms of identifying the housing requirement as something of a never-ending nightmare, because in Scotland, they have Scottish planning policy, and it requires in city regions like Edinburgh that there's a strategic development plan, and that sets out the target and the housing land requirement for each local area, adopted in 2013, so 7 years ago. In England, we might call that a sub-regional or a county plan. Edinburgh then has its own local development plan. That was adopted 4 years ago in 2016. Now, they apply the same test that we do, which is your housing requirement is automatically judged out of date after 5 years. I don't know whether they have the review clause that we have in the MPPF, but they'd be better off without it, wouldn't they? Because it certainly doesn't serve us any purpose. And the housing requirements was then further complicated by the fact that the strategic development plan was updated by a housing land supplementary guidance note in 2014, so not development plan, but largely an SPD. And that was adopted in 2014, but that's more than 5 years old. And then to add to the mix, there was an emerging strategic development plan. Remember the one that was in 2013? That was supported by the inspectors in Scotland, but the Scottish ministers had rejected that. And so having set all of that out, the reporter ultimately sets out what approach he's going to take, and it might be summarized by the phrase, I haven't got a Scooby-Doo what I should do here. I've got 4 different combinations of a requirement, and none of them appear to be anything I can give any weight to. And he says this: ultimately, whilst there is an up-to-date component of the local plan, that's the Edinburgh local plan, the difficulty with such an approach is the figures in that are derived from the strategic plan, which is out of date. Now, all of that just screams, I think, for anybody consulting on the white paper in England, let's have a really simplified approach. Let's just have county planning and a single figure based on a standard methodology. And that, I think, is what Christopher Kitkowski is talking about. Here, we have all the nightmare that we had previously of county plans, regional plans, local plans, and which one was out of date. So let's have a simplified process. This Scottish case illustrates that. I'm sure that's why Sasha asked me to talk about this one. The inspector concluded there was no 5-year land supply. So having said it was all complicated, so I'm going to say there's no 5-year land supply. He referred to the Scottish court case, Gladman Development. They obviously operate in Scotland, and the Scottish ministers, which refers to the application of a tilted balance. And as we know, that phrase came from the Supreme Court in London, which adopted the phrase in the Suffolk Coastal Richborough Estates case. The Supreme Court is, of course, the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, incorporating Scotland. A number of Scottish judges sat on, 3 in fact, sat on that Supreme Court case for Richborough Estates and for Suffolk Coastal, including Lord Gill, whose second judgment is regularly relied upon by appellants in all 5-year land supply cases, and Lord Carnworth, who accordingly who gave the main judgment. More about him later. But despite finding there was no 5-year land supply, the reporter concludes that he doesn't know what the size of the shortfall is. And I have some difficulty with that. I think that's wrong. To have decided there wasn't a 5-year land supply, he had to have decided which of the 4 figures he favoured, because it was only on the emerging strategic plan that you could find there was no 5-year land supply. All the others there was. So he obviously favoured that, but then he wasn't prepared, because the Scottish ministers wouldn't endorse that, to say what the shortfall was. And the consequence of that is he went into the whole issue about the Greenbelt and taking land out of the Greenbelt without any idea about whether it was a 1-year supply or a 4.5-year supply. And I think that's inappropriate, because the size of the shortfall, as we, I think, would all say, is surely relevant to whether you actually have to make difficult decisions like release land from the Greenbelt. And as far as the Greenbelt was concerned, on both sites, he basically said, over my dead body, whether you go for the 500 or the 200. So they lost, and both appeals were dismissed, and you had most of that without the Scottish accent.
Thanks, Chris. That was epic. That's what happens when Chris and I go to the pub the night before the show, is we come up with silly ideas like that. Now, onto our special guest interview with Sir Howard. Over to you, Paul. You're going to lead on this discussion, which I'm hugely looking forward to.
Yeah, so we've had London, we've had Scotland, we've had Sideswell, we've had the Northeast, so now we've come to the heart of England, so Manchester. So can I start by laying my cards on the table? I'm a fan. I came to Manchester in 1989 as a callow-faced 22-year-old from Yorkshire. And when I got to Manchester, Manchester was the coolest place on earth, but still didn't look very different from how it had been in the 60s when my father-in-law left it. In the 30 years that I've been practicing, I've seen an extraordinary transformation in Manchester, and a huge chunk of that is down to you, Sir Howard. You don't get to meet your heroes very often, but I'm going to call you out as mine. So I'm going to start off by telling the world you're my hero. Now, having pathetically sucked up to you and apologise for the fact you sat and had to listen to 4 cases very patiently, and the look on your face when Mary was talking, when you're getting your head around the Sideswell B, was just fantastic. I enjoyed that enormously. So let me take you back. First question. So take you back to 1996, 15th of June, which for our Scottish fans was when England played Scotland and Gascoigne did that amazing overhead kick, which I watched in a house in Salford. At a time that the IRA decided to bomb Manchester and devastate the commercial heart of the city. Very shortly afterwards, you were put in charge as chief exec of Manchester Millennium Limited, which was a task force set up by the city council and government to oversee the reconstruction and redesign of the city centre. And you delivered. You delivered Exchange Square, you delivered Piccadilly Gardens, you delivered New Cathedral Street, you delivered Urbis, and you delivered them on time and on budget. So apart from the obvious amazing thing, which was how on earth did you do that? I want to know, how do you set about planning to achieve that?
Right. Hi, everyone. Great pleasure to be here. And I did enjoy those analyses about those cases, by the way. The idea about having an international design competition, I don't think neither Richard or I could claim the credit for that. That was Michael Heseltine's idea very shortly after the bomb. I was slightly worried about that, if I'm being frank, because being a sort of control freak, you worry about, well, what we're going to get back from this. And the more we thought about it quickly, the more we actually thought it was a very good idea, because what the council at that stage had been very, very good at is understanding what was already working, particularly in the city centre, what its strengths were, where there were weaknesses, frailties. You know, we knew about the lack of permeability and functionality between different parts of the city centre. We knew about the disconnection between the Cathedral Quarter and the rest of the city centre. We knew about, we were constrained to deliver more quality retail space. We wanted to extend the northern boundary, economic boundary of the city centre, so we needed more visitor facilities to underpin that requirement. And we're also very familiar, like everyone else in Manchester, about some of the design frailties of the Arndale. So when we sat down and worked through what the opportunities were, we grasped the notion of a design competition. We brought in help in creating the right framework for how that design competition would be run. We were very specific in terms of what we were asking the design community to respond to in terms of opportunities and overcoming weaknesses. And I think it's fair to say what we got back was a very strong response. And more particularly, we selected a design which was not only commercially driven, but was highly relevant to how we saw the city developing over the next 10, 20 years. And the one point I would like to make beyond that, having done the really hard work in selecting the right design framework, my planning colleagues at the time, working with a whole range of private sector supporters, actually in record time produced supplementary planning guidance to underpin the legitimacy of that design framework, which absolutely gave us the forerunner for driving and guiding investment, which ultimately delivered.
I'm going to come back to that because I'm very interested to see how that approach fits into the overall development plan and regeneration. But one of the things that has been notable in the sort of 20 odd years since that time is how the centre of Manchester has changed from being very few people living there. I think my head of chambers and about 3 others in Cheetham House, next to what's now the Bridgewater Hall, to now a place where tens of thousands of people live. How on earth did you achieve that literal transformation of the city centre to be a place to live?
I think, well, a number of things really. I think the first point is that you were capturing a trend. There was an urban trend towards city centre living, which many of the older industrial cities had not adapted to. Certainly we hadn't. So you always felt that with the right product, there will be demand. So you started then to think through, well, what do you mean by a local authority being very good at place creation? What are the essential characteristics of place? What is the other toolkit you need to underpin market activity? Yeah, Manchester was the first authority to secure urban development grant in the late 80s, I think it was, for Granby House. That was the first time that had been done. So we started to create a market which investors would saw as being sustainable. And so long as the demand and the supply side can be kept in sequence. That's the reason why we've seen so much new housing underpinned by a growth strategy which has been around investing in creative industries, science, innovation, commercial, professional services, ultimately underpinning a new demographic profile for the city.
The startling thing, looking at Manchester with a planning eye, is that although Manchester City's got a core strategy and a UDP, and we've now got a white paper saying the development plan has got to be king, the transformation of the city hasn't actually been driven by the development plan. It's been driven more by sort of informal frameworks, by SPGs, and I've got to say by strong leadership at both political and officer level. It's the message that certainly I was getting when I was going around to other cities, the Leeds, the Newcastles, the Liverpools in the 2000s, that people knew in Manchester that you knew who to speak to and who could deliver. That strong leadership was important. So Manchester's a place to do business was the message. Is that fair in terms of what was one of the drivers for positive investment? And if so, how on earth do we roll that out to other less successful parts of the country? Is it the mayoral system or is it something else, Sir Howard?
Well, I don't think it's just about political structures. I think it's also about culture and ethos. We always saw, my generation always saw planning as a positive tool for growth, for being frank. You go in other parts of the country, and I've had that experience over the past few years, and some see it as a constraint to growth and use it in that way. So we, on the back of our city centre experience, actually, with the supplementary planning guidance, we started to innovate quite a lot with what we describe and is now widely acknowledged as strategic regeneration frameworks, which are lighter touch. They don't carry the same weight, you would argue, as a formal development plan process, but they guide investment around different parts of the city by creating a very strong vision about what each part of that city would actually contribute to the wider good of the city. So where the city centre is concerned, we have different zones of the city, and selling a vision about the role of different parts of the city in achieving that wider Manchester vision. And that's capable of being reviewed every 3-4 years, taking into account the dynamics of the market, taking into account the needs and interests of landowners, investors, developers. And that's become, I think, a very close part of how Manchester does things. And increasingly, we are seeing that being rolled out into different parts of the country.
I was going to ask you a question with regard to leadership and transport and whether or not there's a case for devolution to potentially the mayors for things like transportation and CPO and things of that nature. So feel free to pick up that on the back of that. But just want to move on to a slightly different issue as well, which is you were born in Cheetham Hill, which at the time was very much the heart of the North Manchester Jewish community. Both my two pupil masters, as we called them at the time, stalwarts of the North Manchester Jewish community. So I sort of feel like I've got buy-in to the community in a little bit. Manchester is an amazing place in terms of the diversity of its cultures, and yet the regeneration has seemed to work on the back of these different areas with these different cultures. So how do you get a buy-in from the different communities to what in the planning world is often seen as being a very white middle class male world? How do you get that sort of buy-in from the parts of the city?
By ensuring that your planning policies, the regeneration frameworks I just talked about, reflect community priorities. Good local government engages communities all the time. It's not just on the back of individual planning applications. So if communities, people, residents can actually see the relevance of what we're trying to do over a 5-10 year period and can relate that to their own aspirations and their own priorities in their own neighbourhoods, then I think that's a pretty good way of moving forward. So I think East Manchester, which you and I have worked on very closely over the past several months, Paul, is a very good example of that, where over a 20-year period, there must have been something like 5, 6, 7 strategic regeneration frameworks which have developed over time, how we've actually created the impetus for new housing, for new investment, for wider sport and cultural and entertainment facilities, and where for the vast majority of residents of East Manchester, they see that as a positive, good thing, and an area now where they choose to live rather than, well, they have to live there because they've got no choice.
When all this is over and I can actually buy you a pint in a pub in the city centre, I'll tell you about my wife crying as I'm walking down Alan Turing Road saying, how amazing is this? Look at the City of Manchester Stadium. And I closed those roads. I'll explain the tragic buy-in that I feel to have been part of it. Mary, you've got a question.
I have. Thank you very much. So Howard, what's more important in driving forward regeneration and the delivery of development? A charismatic leader or the duty to cooperate? And should government replace the latter? And if so, with what?
Yeah, I think you've got to look at what you've got to have leadership, whether it's charismatic or not.
Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
But you've got to have leadership. But you've got to have place leadership. The colleagues that I work with over many years will understand what I say is that we never saw ourselves as, you know, the planning officer for Manchester or the chief executive of the city council. We saw ourselves as working for a city, and increasingly in the way in which the city develops and encourages and achieves the level of inclusivity and participation we all want to see characterized by a successful city. You can't just look at your own administrative boundaries. You know, you've got to look at, well, what is the economic geography that underpins the growth and development of this place? And in those terms, Greater Manchester is an economic geography. There are 10 individual local authorities in Greater Manchester. If you want to grow your economy, one of the reasons why we argued for a duty to collaborate was because it shouldn't be discretionary that local authorities work together. It should be a fundamental part of their collaborative partnership approach to change. So whether you're talking about transport, whether you're talking about housing, all fundamental ingredients of competitiveness, whether we're talking about population health, which also goes to the heart of productivity and social cohesion, then you have to cooperate, I believe, in order to be able to deliver and rebuild the city, which we all want it to be. And if I may say so, the requirement to do that in the aftermath of this appalling crisis makes that all the more important. So the real answer to your question is, I really don't know why government should be wanting to withdraw or abolish the duty to cooperate on planning, which strikes me as being absolutely fundamental to delivering growth policies.
Thank you.
Chris, you've got a question.
I have just 2 quick points. First of all, in light of what you said, though, Howard. First of all, other cities have followed. Birmingham has followed what you've done, and they had an SPD called the City Plan to encourage tall buildings, but that was in 2010. You did that a lot earlier than 2010, I think. The second thing is I've had Ian Ritchie, who's been on the show, in today. We're doing a tall building in London. And Ian told me a story about the new Justice Centre in Manchester, which is absolutely fabulous. And he told me that he flew up from London with the Lord Chancellor, Derry Irvine, to have a meeting with you. And their first question was, we understand you've got a car park in the city centre. Can we have it? And you said yes. And then you all went out to lunch. And that was creating the environment in which people who wanted to do something positive, and that Justice Centre is positive, has been encouraged. Now, my question is, given...
Can I just say, Chris, I used to park my car in Gartside Street car park. It's a lot cheaper than Kendall's. So there's downsides to this as well. Sorry.
Yeah. Barristers, they're so selfish. Given the seemingly intractable problem with getting authorities, local authorities, with Manchester City as an exception, to accept housing, evidenced by the fiasco that is the ongoing problem with the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, which appears to be delayed again and possibly even till the next elections next year, local elections. What is the way, do you think, to sell housing to local authorities who seem so reluctant to do it? Is one way the central government to say the Treasury aren't going to give you any money for schools or roads or anything that you need it for unless you deliver the housing, because that's as important to deliver as the schools and the roads? In other words, the Treasury says you get nothing unless you deliver the houses.
Yeah, it's not just housing though, is it? I think that's part of the problem. My sense really is that we tend to look at the planning system in two different ways. We look at in London as how do you actually break down a constraint to development, which it is in large measure, and that's largely because of the system, the fragmentation of responsibilities. Whereas in where I come from, where we are now, in the north of England, we actually look at the planning system as a mechanism for achieving and delivering growth. Part of the, I don't want to go into the spatial framework through them because I'm sure it's not just as simple as not building houses. I think there are issues there about local and central relationships and how you accommodate different levels of targets. My view has always been you have got to incentivize individual authorities in order to plan for growth. It needs to be a sustainable growth path. It needs to be linked to making decisions where the proceeds of growth, whether it's commercial development or residential development, are actually captured directly by the local authority who's making those decisions to benefit the residents who actually live in those places. Bowie's made that point. And of course, what we have at the moment is a government that's looking at it in two different ways at the same time. Treasury want to actually promote development, rightly so too, but want to capture all the lion's share of the proceeds of that growth. And I just don't think that actually works.
I agree, totally agree with you.
Sasha, I think you've been volunteered to select a question from our audience. Do you have a question for Sir Howard?
I have, but I want to ask, I've got a question from the audience. Sir Howard, do you see what's required next for Manchester? What if you had free reign, what would you like to see happen in Manchester next?
Wow. Well, I want us to see is to plan our recovery with a minimum of interference from central government, if I'm being frank with you, in the aftermath of this crisis. I would want us to see access more of our proceeds of growth, and I would want us to access also more resources towards the innovation base of the city, because that's going to be the future of the city, how we capitalise on our key strengths around academic research, what that means for key sectors, for global trade and investment, and also how we create the innovation base to drive up not just district centres, which are not in the city centre, but also town centres around Greater Manchester. And I think because of the strength of partnership, the relationship between academia, the scale and breadth of our business space, the excellence of our transport system, though obviously there's always room for improvement around that with things like HS2, I think we can create a future which not only responds to the current crisis, but actually starts to reinvent what a major city in the UK operating successfully in the global market can achieve.
Can I just very quickly ask you one other thing? I've got a very quick question. Obviously, you've got a unique perspective in your position of Manchester's chief executive. If you had the power, would you take politicians out of planning, or would you keep them making decisions?
we live in a democratic, well, most of the time, a democratic society. At the end of the day, you know, it's absolutely right that key decisions are taken by elected members. They're held accountable for the decisions they make. And by and large, in my experience, we get most of them right in this part of the world, unlike other places I can name. And, you know, that doesn't mean we get everything right, you know, in no different way than I would have got all my decisions right over the years. But by and large, we get the right, we make the right decisions. And we have to improve and support democratic institutions by giving them more power, more resources in order to do what I think Manchester has shown it can do very successfully over the last 20 years, and that is transform the economic and social fortunes of the city.
There's a very somber synergy to our conversation, both the first question I asked you about the 1996 bombing and also the fact that today it's been reported in the planning press that the City Council under your successor, Joanne Roney, have submitted the application for the memorial to those who passed in the second arena. That's reported in the planning press today. And it seems to me to be somehow synergistic, but certainly appropriate that the location for that memorial is right at the edge of Cathedral Square, right at the edge of all the work that's done to bring that area into the heart of the city, which I think is testament to you, all those that worked, and for those of us who are mere citizens of the city, thank you. Thank you, Sir Howard. It's been an absolute privilege to have you on.
Can we ask Sir Howard one last question?
Question, if I may.
Yeah, and Charlie. Yeah, Charlie.
Just a quick one, Sir Howard, relating to your role in setting up and running Manchester Airports Group. This week we've had the Heathrow expansion litigation, the latest litigation report, and the political and legal debate about the third runway have literally lasted the entire end of my career without even a teaspoonful of tarmac being laid. And in the meantime, competition and business growth at and around Heathrow is stagnating, which contrasts with the success of Manchester Airport, which under your leadership of MAG, the airport itself grew and the surrounding area became a thriving business hub, really impressive, national importance. So are there any lessons that you can offer Southeasterners from your involvement with MAG on how to do it right? We're obviously not.
Well, no. One level, keep cocking it up. That ultimately that will benefit Manchester in the longer term, I would have thought. Now, the essential point is we've always seen for 30, 40 years, Manchester Airport as a central part of our growth plan. You know, it's the key platform for our international market base. And, you know, there has never been a moment, there's never been a time when Manchester through that period has not always strived to expand its route network, look at different ways of expanding its attraction for international occupiers, creating employment, and crucially, making the critical linkage between employment creation and the neighbourhoods and communities that live around the airport so that they can balance some of the disbenefits of living in an airport with noise and all the rest of it at the same time as actually benefiting through jobs and successful working lives. And long may that continue.
Thank you.
Yeah, having missed out Charlie on his question, with which I'm completely sorry, can I just qualify what I said a few moments ago? Obviously, huge supporter, Sir Howard, huge admirer, apart from your choice of both sport and team. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for me too. Thank you so much, Sir Howard. Last champion of the week, Mary. I think you were going to do a quick shout out.
Yeah, quick shout out for Steve Quartermain, who interviewed Robert Jenrick, and that's an hour-long interview. It's the lead story today in Planning Magazine, and that's an interesting interview. And come on, Mr. Jenrick, we'd really like you on this show. Come on.
Come on, we'll be nice.
That'll be good.
No, Nudge of the week. I'm going to pick up on the story in Planning magazine last few days that more than half of local authorities in England who were required to publish a housing delivery action plan this year on the basis they scored less than 95% in the housing delivery test haven't done so. 54 councils in total. And so my nudge is firstly to them to do what the NPPF does say they should be doing. And secondly, dare I say, to the planning inspectors to treat a local authority's failure to publish an action plan when they're required to do so as a material consideration when considering housing appeals in relevant local authority areas. If the requirement to produce an action plan is to have any teeth, it seems to me then surely a failure to do it should be taken into account in determining residential appeals. Otherwise, the requirement to produce a plan is just empty words and there's no incentive to do one. And I also think, for that matter, that when an action plan has been published and an application or appeal will deliver on the action plan, that too should be a material consideration for what that's worth. Anyway, that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining us. We're back next Thursday. We can reveal now our special guest next week will be Lord Carnwath, until this year a Justice of the Supreme Court, the planning specialist on the court who authored landmark planning and environmental judgments such as Richborough and Hopkins on the housing land supply and tilted balance, Champion on habitats, HS2 on EIA and SEA, and Sam Smith most recently on Greenbelt policy. And many, many more judgments, both in the Supreme Court, Court of Appeal and High Court before then too. And we're hugely looking forward to hearing his insight at a very timely moment, given the focus on judicial review and its role in planning and generally. Please do email us, as always, with any suggestions. We've received some already, and I think today, in fact, for which many thanks to the person who suggested that. We'll be following that up. Or indeed any questions for Lord Carnwath that you might have. There's a contact link on our website, as you know. Please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Once again, thank you so much, Sir Howard, for honouring us with your presence and your hugely insightful and inspirational, if I may say so, insight. Don't forget the charity donation to the NHS or charity of your choice, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Lovely to have you on the show, Sir Howard.
No, thank you. All the best. Speak to you soon, Paul.
Cheers.
Cheers, mate.